as you said, I mean, the CFC has been a key enabler, and the CFC is an instrument of the federal government. So it's not all bad. They have been enabling this. But yeah, I'm probably not close enough to our federal government. I think I spend too much time attacking them to actually know what they're thinking at the moment. And I don't think I like what they're thinking anyway.
Yes, yeah. Look, I do think it's a missing element. We've seen other federal and governments around the world start bond issuance, particularly I think Germany just recently brought out their first federal green bond. The cornerstone and foundation investor for our green bond fund was actually the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. And the objective for them in helping us launch that fund was to allow a greater spread of investors. In particular, they were concerned that green bonds, as Yen said, it's a relatively small part of the overall market, and it's tended to be dominated by big industry funds, other super funds, insurance companies, and they tend to buy them at primary issuance and then just put them away in the bottom drawer, and it's meant that there's very little opportunity for smaller investors to get involved. And I think the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and ourselves, we felt that was a real shame because we knew there was a lot of unmet demand out there, particularly from for-purpose organisations, for other not-for-profits, charities, faith-based organisations, family offices and so forth, and they weren't able to get access to these assets. And as I said, they're very impactful assets. Part of our job as a fund manager is to combine all of those green bonds that are available in the market into a sensible portfolio, and one that means that investors aren't foregoing any return relative to what they would get from a government bond portfolio, for instance. But also to do, as Yen said, there's a lot of interesting and very crucial reporting that green bond issuers do to give you an idea of how impactful the investment's been. And we're finding that a really key element that investors want to know. They want to see an impact report associated with the investments they make. Bernard?
We know that these green bonds are actually not accessible to our audience directly. They can't walk down the street and say, "Can I put $100 on a green bond, please, and get a return later?" How do our audience, who are both members of congregations, members of the public, members of clergy, young people, how do they know that their money would be invested in a green investment, and how can they access these bonds through third parties?
Yeah, it's the savings and superannuation industry is very complicated, right? So it's quite difficult to drill down and to find out whether your investments are being managed in a style that accords with what you'd like to achieve. And particularly with interest rates very low, we find that people are really attracted to the idea of a dual purpose, that they can get an income, but they can also see that the money's going toward worthwhile projects. So there are specific options that are, I guess, either ethical or sustainable options that are offered by a number of super funds. There are some super funds like Australian Ethical and Future Super who specialise in providing only responsible investment products. So you're getting a specific product from them. Other bigger super funds sometimes have a sustainable option. What we found, to our frustration, is quite often they overlook the defensive, the cash and bond components of those portfolios. They either just leave them in government bonds or in banks, which we think is a bit of a very much an unfortunate abdication of responsibility, really, because they should be as careful about where they invest their debt investments as they are with their equity investments. So consequently, for us, and that's the reason why we created the Altius Green Bond Fund, because it gives a very clear line of sight. You know that you're only going to be invested into social, sustainable or green bonds. And you can see from the reporting that we're able to report back on what the impact of those bond investments are.
Now, in our diocese and our archdiocese, we would be holding a significant investment in our archdiocesan development funds or our diocesan development funds, which goes into finance things like school building projects, parish building projects, childcare centres, hospital extensions, university campus development, depending on that market. It was great to see ACU as one of those signatories or to the green bond market. We know that the Mercies are about 3 years into a divestment program. We know the Jesuits have already gone there. We know the Josephites are starting. And from Tim's advice, we should go and have our 15 minutes of fame with our politician and express what we could do. So for those of us who are in super, we can talk to our superannuation companies and ask what is the best investment that aligns to our own ethical beliefs. What can we do if we're in a congregation or as a Catholic inside a diocese? I'm just trying to think, what is the language we need to speak of when we're talking to the people who run our archdiocesan development funds?
For me, it would be asking them about their climate policy or their fossil fuel policy, where they stand on that, what their beliefs are. So, whoever's managing this, should have, an insight into, that forward-looking risk for their investment.
So long-term risk mitigation
Yes,
against
that's right.
climate risk.
Yeah, as Tim has spoken about, banks, financial institutions, on the one hand, they've committed to funding that renewable investments and the transition to a low carbon economy. And at the same time, some of the larger financial institutions have either announced an exit to coal financing. You have insurers who've come out to say they will not underwrite coal projects. And increasingly, you're getting banks and large superannuation funds that are saying, they're targeting a net zero or have a, net zero emissions target. So I think if you, as an investor, you're still holding these investments, and the banks and the large managers are saying, well, we're going to exit out of it. Who is going to refinance these bonds when they, or loans or projects when they come due? So it's a big stranded risk for them.
And Tim, I had a great question and I just forgot it. So there are a few questions online, Bill. Did you want to chase a few of those up?
I think this one is for Tim, because there was I think a couple of related questions with respect to Michael Moore's film, Planet of the Humans. I don't know if you'd seen it, but obviously one of the key, I guess, misunderstandings of that film was that it was based upon near decade-old data and didn't account for the massive deflation in the cost of renewables. And then, so I guess that's part of the answer to that. But related is a question from Chris about how do investors sit with respect to the risk of their energy projects that they invest in today, given the massive fall in cost with respect to solar and batteries. Is there going to be a much cheaper farm pop up, across the road, and therefore reduce the value of your investment?
Yeah, I just actually put a written answer into the Q&A on the documentary documentary. I mean, it's a work of fiction, and I think it's actually a dangerous film for that very reason. I actually did a radio interview with the ABC, Philip Adams, who's a brilliant interviewer and very well researched, and he went through one by one and just deconstructed the film. It is a work of fiction, and that's where it's dangerous, because Moore has presented himself as though he's an independent documentary maker. But exactly as you said, it relies on facts as they stood more than a decade ago, views as they stood. So if you look at the interviews that he shows, they were more than a decade ago. And so he uses, it was filmed last year, but it uses a lot of archive footage from 10, 15 years ago. And as we know, as Dr. Green just highlighted, solar has dropped by 96% in the last 12 years. So Michael Moore's, he just bangs on about how solar is not viable. Well, yeah, okay, 12 years ago it wasn't. It was an aspiration. Today it's changing the world. Today it's changing the world in India, in China, in Japan, in Germany. Even places in northern Germany are using solar commercially. In Portugal, solar, we just saw an auction at $13 a megawatt hour. Now you can't turn a coal-fired power plant on for less than 20 or $30 a megawatt hour. And there you have solar in Portugal with zero subsidy at $13. It's $13.50 in the UAE. It's $20 in India. So, I mean, every discussion I have in India starts with the premise, look, coal is necessary. It is a necessary evil because we need energy, but we all know solar is the low-cost source of energy for incremental energy. And I mean, that goes from the Prime Minister to the Energy Minister to the Coal Minister of India. Every day, that's the starting viewpoint. So Michael Moore's film is dangerous. It is more than a decade out of date. It pretends to be a documentary when it's a work of fiction, and it's got no balance. So I probably couldn't state that. It's actually counterproductive because it actually destroys hope rather than builds hope. And you had a second half to that question.
It was about the impact of that obviously very useful deflation in costs for renewables, but what does it mean for investments that are made today?
Yeah, it's a very good point. I mean, maybe a decade ago, I remember working with one of Yen's old colleagues, Pablo Baruti at Colonial First State, the head of RIA, and we were writing reports on what's the cost of delay. And from an economic perspective a decade ago, Pablo and I just scratched our head and we really couldn't get our minds around it because the economics weren't as clear-cut as they are today. And so in hindsight, the answer is if you know there's a technology disruption happening, you want to be at the forefront, you don't want to be a laggard. But the idea, so in India, for example, that's the debate we're having right now. Do we build new solar projects or do you wait a year and they'll be 10% cheaper? Now, the answer is they're already 50% cheaper than an existing coal-fired power plant in India. So what we need to do is progressively close the existing coal-fired power plants. We will drive costs for the poor people of India down by 50%, and then we'll drive them down another 10 or 20% in the next 2-3 years. So bottom line is we need to work, we need to invest aggressively, and it's a disruption. The faster we do it, the better we'll all be.
That was the overriding consideration for me for putting solar panels on my house. I knew that the holding pattern, the holding cost savings that I'd make would pay for themselves over 3 to 5 years. And then if I have to replace the panels, they'll be really cheap. So, sorry, Bernard, do you have a question?
I just thought of my pertinent question, and for Yen or to Tim to answer, is that I mentioned before about different congregations, and even Caritas Australia has been pushing for a divestment from our own financial holdings. Is that a relevant advocacy push given what you've told us about the destination of coal? Are we simply wasting our breath when the financial markets may do the job for us?
Yen, you first.
I'd say that in a fixed income portfolio where capital preservation is key, you need to look very carefully at your holdings, because if you're holding a 10, 15-year fossil fuel company, a debt from a fossil fuel company, and when it comes time for repayment and no bank will extend lending or financing to that fossil fuel company, then your investors are going to take a hit. So from a fixed income perspective, yes, I think that it bears to, scrutinize your holdings and scrutinize your policies. If you're holding these, I think you have to have a plan. You have to have a strategy as to what you will do, how you will deal with the, the obsolescence you know, it's changing very quickly. I mean, even though, you know, I first spoke to Tim and Carbon Tracker 8-10 years ago, but it's just accelerated, and you see, but predominantly in the US, your large coal companies are, you know, defaulting or going bankrupt left, right, and center. And I think it will happen here too.
Yeah, it is happening here too. So I think that's spot on, Yen. So maybe just to expand on that, I've done many talks over the last 8 years with 350 on the panel, and 350 advocates for divestment for moral reasons. But at the end of the day, part of the reason why I threw in almost every slide the phrase that fossil fuels is proving to be a wealth hazard. Owning fossil fuels has been destructive to the portfolios. As Yen said, if you're funding the debt, you're not going to get your capital back if the company goes bankrupt. And it's not a question of if they go bankrupt, it's when. And so that's why I mentioned Chesapeake, the biggest fossil fuel or fracking company in America, went bankrupt. Peabody already went bankrupt in 2015, it phoenixed in 2017, and it's now close to going bankrupt a second time. Now, that's unfortunately the Chapter 11, Chapter 7 sort of process of phoenixing, meaning you can just shrug off all your liabilities, cost your banks a whole lot of money, and recapitalize the company. But what is happening in the oil and gas industry in America right now is that the US Fed, through BlackRock, is spending hundreds of billions of dollars of bailing out fossil fuel companies as we speak. So ironically, Trump's $2 trillion stimulus, 20 or 30% of it's actually going to bailing out the fossil fuel industry. So we're socializing all the costs. There are no benefits for them to privatize and steal anymore because they just lose money. I mean, at the end of the day, the biggest problem the coal industry has got right now is it loses money with every ton of coal it produces. But that's at a cyclical low in the middle of the biggest pandemic we've got. But at the end of the day, divestment is couched in moral terms. Fiduciaries have a fiduciary duty to protect their capital. Now, what I'm highlighting is there's an economic imperative to divest because that is the economically sensible strategy to protect your capital. So they are actually entirely aligned.
And I think there's another question about when you're looking at ethical, responsible investments, there's typically a threshold that's applied before an entity is sort of precluded from being an investment in the fund. And that is pretty typical because there are obviously organisations which may have some small legacy businesses that are in a prohibited activity. But that's why I think we found that a static screen based upon an activity measure it was really not good enough. So we have both an advisor, so we have ISS advise us with respect to the ISG profile of a company. And that allows us, and we have a committee that oversees all that research and helps us with making decisions of what we should do with those companies in the grey zone. So Woolworths for us was always a company which we had some issues with because of its involvement in gambling and alcohol. So that was been on an excluded list from our portfolios, our responsible investment portfolios, for the best part of 6 years. And then they came to the market with a green bond and with a divestment strategy to get out of their alcohol and gambling businesses. And we engaged with them and said, look, we are going to buy your green bond and we are going to continue engaging with you. And if you follow through with your divestment process, all well and good. But if you don't, we are very publicly going to divest from your green bond and you will be back on our excluded list. So I think there's a lot to be done rather than just taking a static screening approach. I think engagement and analysis in a more, I guess a little bit more of a subtle way, it pays benefits when you're building a portfolio.
I think, Bill, in sort of rounding it up, a lot of people are asking, well, what can we do? How can we spread the love of this knowledge? How can we activate? Tim's talked very strongly a number of times about talking to your local politician, talk to your local politician. I advocate about you have your locus of control, the things that you can do. Go talk to your politician. You have your circle of influence. Who else can you take along to that meeting? Tanya Plevasek once said in a public meeting, when you've got 5 nuns knocking your door every Thursday morning for a meeting with you, you just cannot refuse them because they're persistent and they go hard and they go early, and they want answers. And we have to, as an audience here now, and those people will see these videos later, we have to aggregate our efforts with our people that we know and be active in the community, because the politicians are the ones representing our views, and we need to tell them our views. And they need to give the message down the line into their parties that this is what the sentiment in the community is, not the coal lobbyist or the gas lobbyist or a climate denier who has a lot of money and runs a newspaper, but what does the public want? Because that's what's going to drive change at a community level. So I just, could I ask each of you one question?
Yes.
And Tim's probably already answered in the past, but perhaps I'll start with Yen and then go to Bill. If you could, if you are Joe Blow or Mrs. Smith on the street, what is one thing that you can do to help change our future from your perspective in this industry?
That's a very tough question, Bernard. And to answer it personally, you know, the environment is something that is a cause that's close to my heart. So I support, you know, organizations or entities like the Australian Conservation Foundation. I've occasionally partaked in a Get Up campaign, whether I donate or I write. And as you know, Tim has said, it's important to write to your local member if you have concerns. Yes, it does take time. But, you know, to secure and protect my child's future, I feel that it's a time that's worth spending. I would also change my banking and write to your super fund.
Thank you.
Look, I guess I approach this on multiple levels. So my day job, obviously, I'm advocating for responsible investment and yeah, action on climate and so forth as a investment professional. But in my spare time, like Yen, I'm also involved in a number of sort of advocacy groups and organisations. And then just in my friend group, you know, I try to engage them. And if possible, get them to lobby, as I said, you know, media organisations. You know, every time the news report comes on and talks about sort of record temperatures and bushfires and so forth, just say, why didn't you mention climate change? So again, just to kind of keep reiterating and not letting them get away with sort of avoiding the question, I think is the key thing.
And Tim, you can answer this one because this is probably the most loaded one. I was rowing on the Como River at 6 o'clock this morning, and of course I'm rowing through Craig Kelly's area, and a question just came up from John Day. How do I talk to my local member, Craig Kelly?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking with someone who's proposing to stand against Craig Kelly because she firmly believes he is denying science and he is damaging intergenerational equity in Australia. But he's at least relatively honest about it. He openly denies the science. He openly undermines the science. He undermines action. So, yeah, you could go and have a meeting with him, but you're actually not going to change his mind. I mean, at the end of the day, the dinosaurs will die. We need to vote them out. I'm talking about voting them out, and I'm talking about holding. So go and meet with the opposition candidates and make sure that they are all firm on it, and then talk to your local. If you're unlucky enough to be in Craig Kelly's electorate, go and talk to all of the other candidates or hand out flyers for anyone but Craig. Anyone that Get Up used the campaign tactic at the last election, and I'm not an advocate for Get Up, but they're effective. Well, so I probably am. But their attitude was, look, we're politically agnostic. We just want the members of Parliament to acknowledge the science and act and vote accordingly. So go to every town hall in Craig Kelly's electorate, every one of them. You have the right as a local voter to go to those town halls and just keep asking questions. just be polite, ask the question. Don't expect Craig to change his mind. He won't. He's a used car salesman who has clearly taken the money hook, line and sinker and is not going to reform himself. So just support all the other candidates and make sure you talk to all your friends about, make sure their preferential voting goes to every other candidate and put him at the bottom. Put any climate science at the bottom.
Thank you, Tim. And we need to draw this to a close. And I'd just like to thank Bill for hosting, throwing you into the into the foray here. Thank you very much, Yen, and Tim also. A very insightful presentation, and your slides will be made available to our audience. And perhaps, Claire, we could just flick to the next slide as well, just to contextualise this conversation. So our Convocation, we had a session the other day, which is a replay with Tim hosting, Ross Garno and Bronwyn Lay, setting the scene for what Australia can do in terms of it's only a great renewable recovery that cares for the common good and cares for our common home. And now we've talked about where investment is going, heavily in the renewable area, heavily out of the stranded assets of coal and other fossil fuels. And next Tuesday, we're setting the scene with Catholic social teaching. And then Michael and Louise from Australian Catholic Super are going to talk about where, first of all, setting the scene on what is corporate social responsibility 101. And then secondly, all those sticky questions that superannuation companies have in terms of why are you still investing in fossil fuels with this and that, asking that question of why don't we have enough investment in the Australian market that was already highlighted, perhaps why the Dubbo subscription was so high because they're trying to do that. So we're really trying to take you to that next step of examining where your money is sitting in your super, if you have a super account. And then of course, then we'll capture it at the end with actually leadership stories of leadership in this space. And then we have an international youth conversation where we have Samoa, Tonga, New Zealand, Australia, Malta, Uganda, and Russia, youth talking to each other. And we're looking forward to that conversation as well before our last liturgy. Thank you, Claire. So I'd like to thank everyone for being online. I'd particularly like to thank Tim, because this is the second time he's had to roll up to one of these now. He's done a great job. And Bill and Yen, thank you so much for your input. It's been really appreciative, and I wish you all the best with your engagement with Australian corporates and getting our money into the green investments.
Terrific. Thanks, Bernard. It's been a pleasure. It's a very enjoyable experience, and thanks for all the great engagement from the audience as well, and the great questions. And yeah, happy to come along anytime you'd like us to be here.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bernard.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Yeah.